A pregnant black woman stands alone at an airport, a small suitcase by her side, and the weight of the world on her shoulders. She's waiting in line, distracted, her hand resting on her belly as she feels a gentle kick. But her moment of peace is abruptly shattered by a voice dripping with disdain. "Hey! You, step out of line." A uniformed police officer approaches her, his eyes scanning her up and down with a look of disgust. He grabs her arm, pulling her out of line roughly, and suddenly, every eye in the terminal is on them. She stumbles slightly, caught off guard by the aggression. Confused, she tries to explain. "I'm just here to catch a flight, I don't care what you're doing." "Show me your ID, now," he barks, not even attempting to hide his contempt. She hesitates for a moment, her heart pounding. "You got a problem following orders," he snaps. There's a moment where she looks around, expecting someone to step in, to say something. But the people around her just avert their eyes, pretending not to see, pretending not to hear. It's a scene that's all too familiar, a public humiliation, a silent complicity. When she hands him her ID, he barely glances at it before pushing it back at her. "You don't belong here, and I don't know who you think you are, but you're not gonna get any special treatment." The officer's words are like a punch to the gut, the kind of deep, scarring pain that lingers long after the moment has passed. She feels the stares of the bystanders, feels the judgment in their eyes. But she also feels something else. Anger. And not just for herself, but for every person who has been treated like they were less. "What do you think you're doing?" she asks, her voice surprisingly steady. "What am I doing?" The officer's laugh is sharp and bitter. "I'm doing my job, and my job is to make sure people like you don't cause any problems." The moment he says it, there's a chill in the air, a silence that speaks louder than any words. People like you. It's clear what he means, and everyone in the terminal knows it. But she's had enough. She's tired of this, tired of the condescension, the constant underestimation, the assumption that she's powerless. She takes a step forward, her chin lifted, and for a brief second, it seems like she's going to let him have it, right there in front of everyone. But then she stops herself. She takes a breath, and there's a glint in her eyes, a hint of something that nobody, especially not this officer, can understand. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" she says softly, almost to herself. But there's something in the way she says it that makes the officer hesitate, just for a moment. "I don't need to know who you are," he snaps, but his voice falters. "You're coming with me." And just like that, she's being dragged away, the officer's grip tight on her arm, as if she's some kind of criminal. People watch, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, but nobody dares to intervene. It's easier to let things happen, easier to just watch. But they have no idea. No idea who she is, or the power she holds. No idea that this woman, this pregnant black woman, who they're watching being humiliated and disrespected, is not just another face in the crowd. She's the newly elected mayor of the city, a fact that the officer will come to learn in the most shocking way possible. It's a story of power and prejudice, of a man who thought he could get away with his bigotry because he wore a badge. It's about the quiet, simmering rage that so many carry with them, and what happens when that rage is finally allowed to erupt. Because when she finally reveals who she is, it's not just the officer who's going to feel the consequences. It's a whole system that's going to be held accountable. She's not just going to get justice for herself, she's going to make sure this moment sparks something bigger, something that can't be ignored, something that forces change. So, what will she do with this power? How will she turn this moment of humiliation into a moment of reckoning, not just for the officer who dared to disrespect her, but for an entire community that's been overlooked and mistreated for too long? Stay with us, because what happens next will leave you speechless. You think you know where this is going, but trust me, you don't want to miss how she turns this around. Hey everyone, before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to address something important. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. We believe in uplifting and supporting the Black community, amplifying voices, and sharing stories that matter. No one should ever have to face prejudice for who they are, and we're here to make that loud and clear. Now, get ready for a powerful story that highlights resilience, justice, and unexpected twists. If you enjoy our content, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the like button. Your support means everything to us. Enjoy the story, and thank you for being here with us. Monique sat in her office, gazing out at the bustling streets of downtown Atlanta. The city had always been a place of contrast, a mix of progress and tradition, culture and complexity, hope and struggle. It was the city where she was born, where she grew up, and now, the city she was determined to lead. At just 32 years old, Monique had made history as the youngest and first Black woman to be elected mayor of Atlanta. Her victory was a powerful message, a symbol of change in a place that still bore the scars of its past. But Monique was no stranger to challenges. She had grown up in the heart of the city, in a neighborhood often overlooked and underfunded. Her mother, a single parent, worked 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads. Monique learned early on that nothing would be handed to her, and if she wanted a better life, she'd have to fight for it. That's exactly what she did. She excelled in school, earned scholarships, and eventually graduated with honors from one of the best law schools in the country. But despite her success, she never forgot where she came from. She ran for office not just to lead, but to serve, to be the voice for communities that had long been ignored. She was 3 months into her term, and every day was a new battle. The city was facing numerous issues: homelessness, racial inequality, police reform. The expectations on her were sky high, and she felt the pressure every moment. But Monique was not one to shy away from hard work. She was known for her relentless dedication and fierce intelligence. Even her political opponents respected her tenacity, even if they didn't always agree with her. Still, there was one issue that had been a thorn in her side since day one: police reform. The tension between the Black community and the police was palpable, a deep-seated mistrust that had been festering for decades. As mayor, Monique knew she had to address it. She had already started laying the groundwork for change, pushing for stricter accountability, mandatory body cameras, and better community engagement programs. But change was slow, and resistance was strong. There were those within the police force, and even within the city council, who did not want to see the system change. For them, the old way was the only way, and they saw Monique as a threat to that. And then there was Officer Travis Moore. Travis was a veteran cop, a man who had spent over 2 decades on the force. He was known for being tough, stern, and, some would say, unyielding. To some, he was a hero, a cop who didn't bend, who upheld the law no matter what. But to others, he was a symbol of everything wrong with the system. Travis had a reputation for being harsh, especially with Black residents. He'd had multiple complaints filed against him over the years, but nothing had ever stuck. He was protected by the system, and he knew it. To him, people like Monique were the problem. He'd heard about her plans for reform, and he wasn't happy about it. In his eyes, these reforms were a direct attack on his authority, and he was not about to let someone, especially a young, Black woman, tell him how to do his job. Monique had heard about Travis, but she hadn't interacted with him directly. She was too busy running the city to deal with individual officers. But she knew his type. Men who believed they were above reproach, untouchable. Men who used their badges as shields to hide their prejudices. It was exactly the kind of culture she was trying to change, but she also knew it wouldn't be easy. She had to be strategic, careful, and she had to pick her battles. One Friday afternoon, Monique was preparing to head out of the office for a weekend trip. She had been looking forward to it all week, a rare chance to unwind, even if just for a couple of days. She had planned everything meticulously. She needed a break, not just for herself, but for the baby she was carrying. At 5 months pregnant, she was starting to feel the strain of her hectic schedule, and her doctor had warned her to take it easy. The airport was busy, as always. Travelers rushed from one terminal to another, dragging suitcases, saying quick goodbyes, or moving with the focused determination of people who knew exactly where they needed to be. Monique blended into the crowd, her scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, a large pair of sunglasses shielding her eyes. She wasn't trying to hide who she was, but she also wasn't in the mood for any attention. She just wanted to get through security and onto her flight without any drama. As she stood in line, she noticed an officer patrolling nearby, his eyes scanning the crowd with a stern, calculating expression. Travis Moore was doing his rounds, and he wasn't in a good mood. The past few weeks had been rough for him. There had been more talks of reform, more pressure on the police department, and he felt like he was under attack. His pride was bruised, and he was ready to take it out on someone. When his eyes landed on Monique, something clicked in his mind. She looked familiar, but he couldn't quite place her. All he saw was a black woman standing in line, and for some reason, that was enough to set him off. He watched her for a moment, and then, without hesitation, made his way over. "Ma'am, I need to see your ID," he said, his tone curt. Monique turned to him, startled by the sudden interruption. "Excuse me," she replied, pulling her sunglasses down slightly to meet his eyes. "I said, I need to see your ID," he repeated, louder this time, drawing the attention of several people around them. "Now." Monique felt a mix of confusion and irritation. She was used to people asking her for ID, but there was something about the way he said it, the way he was looking at her, that made her uneasy. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. "The problem is, you need to step out of line and come with me," he said, grabbing her arm. There was no explanation, no patience. Just a sudden, aggressive move that caught her completely off guard. "Let go of me," she said, pulling back. But he tightened his grip, his face inches from hers. "I said, you're coming with me," he hissed, and Monique felt a wave of anger rise within her. She could feel the stares of people around them, could hear the murmurs, but no one said a word. They just watched as this man, this officer, treated her like she was nothing, like she didn't matter. And at that moment, she made a decision. She wasn't going to stay silent. Not this time. She looked him straight in the eyes, her voice steady, but full of resolve. "Do you have any idea who I am?" she asked. Travis hesitated for just a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing his face, but then he smirked. "I don't care who you are," he said, dismissively. "You're just another person who thinks they can get away with breaking the rules." He had no idea. And that was his first mistake. Monique could still feel the officer's grip on her arm long after she had been escorted out of the airport terminal. Her heart was pounding, but she forced herself to stay calm. Travis had led her to a small, cramped office, far from the bustling crowds, and made her sit down. The air was thick with tension, and she could see the flicker of satisfaction in his eyes as he stood over her, as if he had already won some unspoken battle. Travis leaned against the desk, his arms crossed, his badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. "You know, you people always think you can bend the rules," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "But not today. Not on my watch." He was practically sneering, and Monique could feel the heat rising to her face. She wanted to scream, to push him away, but she knew she couldn't lose control. "Not here. Not like this. I have a right to know why I'm being detained," she said, her voice steady, but there was a sharp edge to it. Travis just smirked, as if her words didn't matter. "You're not being detained, ma'am," he said mockingly, emphasizing the word ma'am in a way that made her stomach turn. "You're being questioned. There's a difference." She could feel the power dynamic shifting, and it infuriated her. Here she was, the mayor of this city, yet she was being treated like she was nothing, like she had no voice, no authority. "I don't have time for this," she said, standing up, but Travis stepped forward, blocking her path. "Sit down," he ordered, and for a moment, they were face to face, the tension between them almost tangible. "No," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "I'm not sitting down." He blinked, clearly not expecting her defiance. "You think you can walk out of here?" he said, his tone darker now. "I can make sure you don't go anywhere, sweetheart." Monique's blood boiled at that word, sweetheart. It was condescending, dismissive, and so loaded with disrespect that she could barely keep herself from snapping. "Let me make this clear," she said, her voice low, but every word deliberate. "You have no right to keep me here without cause. And you sure as hell don't have the right to threaten me." She could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Travis straightened up, his jaw tightening. "Don't think you can intimidate me with your fancy words," he said, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're just another person who thinks they're above the law. But I'm here to remind you that you're not." Monique felt a chill run down her spine, but she forced herself to remain calm. She knew this wasn't just about her, it was about everything she represented, everything she was fighting for. "Is that what you tell yourself?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "That you're protecting the law? Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like you're just trying to protect yourself." The room fell silent, and for a moment, Travis just stared at her, his expression unreadable. "You think you're clever, huh?" he said finally, but there was a hint of doubt in his voice now. "You think you can walk in here and talk your way out of this? Well, let me tell you something, lady, nobody's going to back you up. Not when they hear about the trouble you've caused." She could see what he was trying to do, he was trying to intimidate her, to make her doubt herself. But it wasn't going to work. Not this time. "I don't have to talk my way out of anything," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Because I haven't done anything wrong. But you, on the other hand, are about to have a lot of explaining to do." Travis opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, there was a knock at the door. Both of them turned as another officer stepped inside, looking slightly nervous. "Is everything all right in here?" he asked, glancing between Monique and Travis. "Everything's fine," Travis said quickly, but the other officer didn't seem convinced. "We've got a situation," he said, lowering his voice. "There's been a call, someone's asking questions." Monique's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know who had made the call, but she could sense that something was shifting, something was about to change. Travis's eyes narrowed. "Who?" he asked, his tone sharp. "Who's asking questions?" The other officer hesitated, then glanced at Monique. "It's from City Hall," he said. "They're saying, she's the mayor." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just been dropped. Travis's face went pale, and for a moment, he looked like he'd been punched in the gut. "What?" he whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Monique felt a flicker of satisfaction, but she kept her expression neutral. She wasn't going to let him see how much she was enjoying this moment. "Yeah," the other officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're saying she's the new mayor of Atlanta." There was a long, tense silence, and Monique could practically see the gears turning in Travis's head as he tried to process what he had just learned. He looked at her, his eyes wide, as if seeing her for the first time. This can't be," he stammered, but the certainty in his voice was gone. "Why didn't you say anything?" Monique raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a small, cold smile. "Would it have made a difference?" she asked softly. "Would you have treated me any differently if you had known who I was?" Travis didn't respond. He just stood there, his face a mix of confusion, anger, and fear. The realization that he had made a grave mistake was slowly dawning on him, but he didn't know how to fix it. I didn't," he began, but the words died in his throat. "You didn't what?" Monique asked, stepping closer. "You didn't know. You didn't care. Or maybe you just didn't think it mattered who I was because you assumed you could get away with treating me like this." The other officer looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, clearly not sure what to do. "Maybe we should let her go," he said quietly, but Travis glared at him. "No," he snapped. "She's not going anywhere." Monique could feel the tension building, like a storm that was about to break. "You're making a mistake," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm giving you one last chance to make this right. Let me go, or this is going to get a lot worse for you." But Travis was too far gone, too blinded by his own arrogance and pride to see the warning signs. "You think you can threaten me?" he said, his voice rising. "I'm not afraid of you. I've dealt with people like you my whole life, and I'm not about to start backing down now." Monique didn't flinch. She just looked at him, her eyes cold, and said, "Then I guess we'll see how this plays out." As she spoke, she could hear the sound of footsteps approaching, a low murmur of voices outside the room. Something was happening, something bigger than either of them, and she could feel it coming, like the calm before the storm. The door opened again, and this time, several more people entered the room, their faces serious, their eyes fixed on Travis. "Sir, we need to talk," one of them said, and Monique could see the fear flash across his face. For the first time, he looked truly afraid. And as he stood there, surrounded, Monique felt a sense of calm wash over her. She knew the tide was turning. The question now was how far it would go, and just how deep the consequences would be. Something big was coming, and Travis wasn't ready for it. But she was. And she was going to make sure that when it hit, it would be impossible for him, or anyone else, to ignore. The tension in the small, windowless room was suffocating. Monique sat calmly, her hands resting on the table, but her eyes were sharp, watching every move. She could sense the shift in the air, the mounting pressure that Travis was too stubborn to see. The room had filled with more officers and a few officials from City Hall, each of them wearing expressions that ranged from cautious to outright concerned. Travis, however, remained defiant, standing tall as if the very act of acknowledging the growing reality would somehow be a defeat. One of the city officials, a tall man in a navy suit, cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Officer Moore," he began, his tone formal but uneasy, "we need to discuss the situation here. This," he glanced at Monique, then back at Travis, "is not something we can overlook." "What situation?" Travis snapped, his voice louder than he intended. "She was causing a disturbance, and I was doing my job. This has nothing to do with her position." He practically spat the word, as if saying it out loud would make it real. The man in the suit hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "It has everything to do with her position, Officer Moore," he said quietly. "The woman you detained is Monique Harris, the mayor of this city. You are aware of that now, aren't you?" For a moment, Travis just stared, his mind reeling. He had been so certain, so convinced of his authority, and now it was all crumbling around him. "That doesn't change anything," he said finally, though there was a tremor in his voice. "She still has to follow the rules, just like everyone else." Monique leaned back in her chair, her gaze never leaving him. "Tell me, Officer Moore," she said, her tone almost conversational, "what rules did I break today? What exactly did I do that made you think it was necessary to pull me out of line and detain me?" Travis hesitated, his jaw clenched. He couldn't give her an answer because he knew there wasn't one. But admitting that meant admitting he was wrong, and that was something he wasn't prepared to do. You were acting suspiciously," he said, stumbling over the words. "I had reason to believe, you had reason to believe," Monique interrupted, her voice rising slightly, "that a black woman standing in an airport, minding her own business, was somehow a threat." The room fell silent, the question hanging heavy in the air. "Or is it that you just didn't think someone like me could possibly be the mayor of this city?" Travis's face flushed, but he didn't respond. He glanced around the room, looking for support, but found none. The other officers, the officials, even his colleagues, they were all waiting, watching him. It was clear now that whatever control he thought he had was slipping away. Monique took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had to be careful with her words, even now. "I've spent months working on reforms," she said, addressing not just Travis but everyone in the room. "Trying to build trust, to make sure our police force reflects the values of this community. But how can I do that when there are still people who believe they can abuse their power without consequence?" "Abuse?" Travis scoffed, though his voice was weaker now. "You call this abuse? I was just what?" Monique cut him off, leaning forward, her eyes blazing. "Just doing your job? Just enforcing the law? Or were you just trying to remind me, and everyone else who looks like me, that people like you still have the power to decide who belongs and who doesn't?" Travis didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of her words hit him like a punch, each one driving deeper than the last. But Monique wasn't finished. She had spent too long staying quiet, too long letting moments like this pass without confronting them. "I want you to understand something, Officer Moore," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. "You didn't just disrespect me today. You disrespected this city. You disrespected every person who has ever been treated as less than because of the color of their skin, every person who has been made to feel small, invisible. That's what you did today." She could see the shift in the room, the way people were reacting to her words. Some of them were nodding, others looked uncomfortable, but no one was turning away. They were all listening, really listening, maybe for the first time. Travis, on the other hand, was visibly shaking, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I don't need to listen to this," he said, but there was no conviction behind the words. "This is just politics. This is just you trying to make me look bad." "No," Monique said quietly, but firmly. "This isn't politics, Officer Moore. This is about accountability. Something you clearly don't understand." She let the words sink in, and then she turned to the city officials. "I want this on record. Every word, every action that took place here today. I want a full report. And I want to know why someone like this is still wearing a badge." Travis's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked like a cornered animal. "You can't do that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have the authority." "Actually, I do," Monique replied, cutting him off. "And not just because I'm the mayor. I have the authority because I'm a citizen of this city, and I'm demanding accountability. Something every person in this room has a right to do." The room was dead silent. No one dared to speak. Travis looked around, his eyes wild, but there was no escape. He had been backed into a corner, and there was no way out. "This is ridiculous," he said finally, though the words sounded hollow. "You're making a big deal out of nothing." Monique felt a surge of anger, but she kept it under control. "Do you really believe that?" she asked, her voice low, intense. "Do you really think that what happened here today is nothing? Because if that's the case, then you're exactly the kind of person who shouldn't be in a position of power." She turned back to the officials, who were still watching, still listening. "I want a full investigation," she said. "Not just into what happened today, but into every complaint that has ever been filed against Officer Moore. I want to know how many people he's mistreated, how many people he's made feel like they were less than. And I want to know why nothing was done about it." The officials exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable. They hadn't expected this, hadn't expected her to push this hard. But they could see there was no stopping her now. We'll see what we can do," one of them said finally, his voice hesitant. "But these things take time, make the time," Monique said sharply. "Because if you don't, I will. And I guarantee you, I won't be the only one asking questions." Travis took a step forward, as if he was about to say something, but Monique raised her hand, stopping him. "No," she said. "You've said enough. More than enough. Now it's my turn." There was a pause, and then she continued, her voice steady, but full of emotion. I grew up in this city, she said, and for a moment, her voice softened, as if she was speaking to herself as much as to them. I know what it feels like to be looked down on, to be treated like you don't belong. I've lived it. And I've worked my whole life to change that, to make this city a place where everyone can feel safe, where everyone can feel like they matter. But how can I do that if the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones making us feel unsafe? She turned to Travis, her gaze piercing. You thought you could intimidate me, she said. You thought you could use your badge to silence me. But you were wrong. Because I'm not just here to lead this city, I'm here to change it. And that means making sure people like you are held accountable. The room was silent, the air thick with tension. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak. Travis looked around, his face pale, his eyes darting from one person to another, as if searching for someone who would back him up. But there was no one. Monique stood up, her eyes never leaving his. This isn't over, she said, and there was a quiet, determined strength in her voice. Not by a long shot. Because I'm not going to stop until this city is a place where everyone is treated with respect, where no one has to fear the people who are supposed to protect them. And if that means taking on the entire system, then that's exactly what I'll do. As she walked out of the room, leaving Travis and the others behind, she could feel the eyes of everyone on her. She knew this was just the beginning, that there was still a long fight ahead. But for the first time, she felt a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. Because now, people were paying attention. And she was going to make sure they kept listening. Something was changing, and Travis knew it. He could feel the walls closing in, the reality he had been so certain of crumbling away. He had underestimated her, underestimated the power of her voice, and now he was going to pay the price. But Monique wasn't finished. Not yet. Because there was still one more truth that needed to be revealed, one more blow that would ensure Travis and those like him would never forget this day. And it was coming, faster than he could have ever imagined. Monique stepped out of the room, the echo of her last words still lingering in the air. The hallways of the police precinct were strangely quiet, as if the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. She could feel the eyes on her as she walked, the whispers starting to spread, but she kept her head high, her steps steady. She had set things in motion, and now it was time to make sure they didn't stop. As she reached the exit, she was met by a small group of reporters who had caught wind of the incident. They crowded around her, their cameras flashing, their microphones thrust forward, but Monique didn't flinch. She had been expecting this. She wanted this. Because the story needed to be told, and she was going to be the one to tell it. Mayor Harris, can you tell us what happened inside? One of the reporters asked, his voice almost drowned out by the murmurs around him. Monique paused, letting the question hang for a moment. Then she looked directly into the camera, her expression calm but intense. What happened today is something that happens every day, to people all over this city, she said. I was singled out, detained, and disrespected not because of anything I did, but because of who I am. Because of the way I look. And that's not just wrong, it's unacceptable. The reporters went silent, stunned by her directness. She could see the shock on their faces, but she wasn't done. I ran for mayor because I wanted to make this city a better place, she continued, her voice strong. But we can't do that if we don't address the systemic issues that have been ignored for too long. What happened to me today is a symptom of a much bigger problem, and it's time we start talking about it. From behind the glass doors, Travis watched the scene unfold, his heart pounding. He could feel the panic rising inside him, the realization that everything was slipping out of his control. He had thought he could contain the situation, but now it was exploding in front of him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Back inside, the officials and officers who had witnessed the confrontation were gathered in a huddle, their faces grim. They knew they had to act quickly, but the problem was bigger than just one officer. They were facing a scandal that could ripple through the entire department, and the more they tried to contain it, the worse it seemed to get. The door swung open, and Travis stormed back in, his face flushed with anger. "This is a setup," he said, his voice shaking. "She's trying to make me look bad, trying to drag my name through the mud just to push her agenda." One of the senior officers, Captain Daniels, looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Travis, you need to calm down," he said quietly. "This isn't about you." "The hell it's not," Travis shot back, his hands clenched into fists. "She's out there making me sound like some kind of monster, and you're just going to stand here and let her do it?" Daniels sighed, rubbing his temples. He had been in the force long enough to know when a situation was spiraling out of control, and this was one of those times. "You brought this on yourself, Travis," he said finally. "You had no reason to detain her, no grounds to treat her the way you did. And now, we're all paying the price." Travis glared at him, his eyes wild. "So you're just going to throw me under the bus? After everything I've done for this department?" "Enough," another voice said, and everyone turned to see Chief Wallace standing in the doorway. The room fell silent, the tension thickening as he stepped forward. "This isn't about loyalty, or politics, or protecting anyone's reputation. It's about what's right. And what you did today, Travis, was wrong. Plain and simple." Travis felt a jolt of fear, but he masked it with anger. "You're taking her side," he demanded. "She's trying to turn this into a circus. She's the one playing politics." Wallace's eyes narrowed. "No, Travis. She's holding you accountable. Something you should have been ready for the moment you put on that uniform." There was a pause, and then, almost as if a dam had broken, the voices of the other officers started to rise, murmuring agreements, shaking heads, and exchanging looks. They knew what Travis had done was wrong, but acknowledging it out loud felt like crossing a line they had been afraid to touch for too long. Wallace turned to the others, his expression serious. "We need to do the right thing here," he said. "If we don't address this, if we don't take responsibility, then we're no better than the problem we're trying to solve." Meanwhile, outside, Monique continued to address the reporters, but now, her tone was different. "I'm not here to attack anyone," she said, her voice softer, but still resolute. "I'm here to start a conversation. Because this isn't just about me. It's about every person in this city who has ever been treated unfairly, every person who has been judged because of the color of their skin, every person who has felt powerless. That ends now." The crowd began to murmur, a mixture of support and curiosity. She could see people nodding, could feel the energy shifting, and she knew she had them. But there was one more thing she needed to do. She needed to make sure this moment would lead to real change, and that meant going beyond words. "I've already requested a full investigation into the conduct of Officer Travis Moore," she said, her eyes glinting with determination. "And I'm calling on the police department to review its policies, to ensure that no one else has to go through what I went through today. This is not about punishment, it's about accountability, about making sure that the people who are supposed to protect us are held to the highest standard. And I will not stop until that happens." Inside, Travis felt his heart drop. He knew what an investigation would mean, knew what it could uncover. It wasn't just about today, there were other complaints, other incidents that had been swept under the rug. Things he had thought would never see the light of day. "She can't do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but no one was listening. Chief Wallace turned to him, his expression stern. "She already has," he said quietly. "And now, we have to decide how we're going to respond. We can do this the hard way, or we can start making things right." Travis wanted to argue, wanted to fight, but he could feel the walls closing in around him, and for the first time, he understood how powerless he truly was. He had spent his whole career believing that he was untouchable, that the badge he wore would protect him no matter what. But now, he was facing the consequences of that arrogance, and there was no way to escape them. Outside, Monique finished her statement, but before she could step away, one of the reporters called out, "Mayor Harris, what do you say to those who claim this is just a political stunt?" Monique paused, then turned back to the camera, her expression calm, but resolute. "This isn't about politics," she said. "It's about justice. It's about making sure that the people who live in this city feel safe, feel heard, and feel respected. And if anyone thinks that's a stunt, then maybe they need to take a closer look at what kind of city they want to live in." The words hit hard, and she could see the impact they were having, not just on the reporters, but on the people around them, the people watching from the sidelines, from their phones, from their homes. She had turned a moment of humiliation into a moment of power, and she wasn't going to let it go. Back inside, Travis was led away by another officer, his head hanging low, his face pale. He didn't resist, didn't argue. He had nothing left to say. As he was escorted through the precinct, he could see the faces of his colleagues, some sympathetic, others cold, but all of them distant. They were seeing him differently now, and he knew it. He had become the example, the one who would be remembered not for his years of service, but for his fall from grace. Chief Wallace watched him go, then turned back to the remaining officers. "This is the beginning," he said, his voice firm. "Not the end. We have a lot of work to do, and it's not going to be easy. But it starts now." Outside, Monique walked away from the cameras, her heart still pounding, but she allowed herself a small smile. She knew there would be backlash, knew there would be people who would try to twist the narrative, but she didn't care. Because she had done what she needed to do, and she wasn't done yet. As she got into the car waiting to take her back to City Hall, she took a moment to breathe, to let the reality of what had happened sink in. She had confronted the system, and she had won. But this was just one battle, and there were many more to come. And as the car pulled away, the image of Travis being led out in handcuffs flashed across every screen in the city, a powerful reminder that no one, not even those who thought they were untouchable, could escape accountability. The news of Officer Travis Moore's detention spread across Atlanta like wildfire. Within hours, it was on every news channel, every social media platform, every conversation. It wasn't just a local story anymore, it was national. People across the country were seeing the footage of Monique standing tall outside the precinct, addressing the media with a calm but fierce determination. They were hearing her words, words that resonated far beyond the city limits, words that called for justice, accountability, and change. Inside City Hall, Monique sat in her office, her mind racing as she processed everything that had happened. The morning had been chaos, calls from council members, activists, community leaders, and even state officials, all wanting to know what her next steps would be. There was support, certainly, but there was also pushback. She could sense the unease in some of their voices, the fear of what this could mean for the city, for their careers, for the delicate balance they had tried to maintain. Monique knew she had struck a nerve, and she wasn't sure yet how deep it would go. But one thing was clear, she had forced a conversation that could no longer be ignored, and now the city had to face it, whether they were ready or not. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to see Malik, her chief of staff, standing there. His expression was serious, but there was a hint of pride in his eyes. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Monique nodded, gesturing for him to sit. "I know," she said. "It's going to be a long day." Malik took a seat across from her, leaning forward slightly. "You did good out there, Monique. You handled it perfectly. But this is just the beginning. The department's already in damage control mode, and there's a lot of pressure coming from certain circles to make this go away quietly." "I'm not surprised," she replied, a hint of frustration in her voice. "They've been protecting people like Travis for years. They think they can just sweep this under the rug and pretend it never happened. But not this time." Malik nodded, but his expression grew more serious. "You need to be prepared for what comes next. This investigation could open up a lot of old wounds, expose things that people have tried very hard to keep hidden. It's going to get messy, and they're going to come after you. Hard." "I know," she said, meeting his gaze. But I'm not backing down. If this city is ever going to change, we have to start somewhere. And if that means going through the mess, then that's what we'll do. Malik sighed, but there was a hint of a smile on his lips. I figured you'd say that. Just, be careful. They're going to try to spin this, make it look like you're attacking the police, undermining their authority. They'll do everything they can to paint you as the villain. Let them try, Monique said, her eyes flashing with determination. I'm not attacking the police. I'm holding them accountable. There's a difference. And if they can't see that, then maybe they're part of the problem. As Malik left the room, Monique felt a mix of emotions swirling inside her. She knew this wasn't going to be easy, but she also knew she couldn't back down now. She had come too far, fought too hard, to let fear dictate her actions. This was a moment of reckoning, not just for Travis, but for the entire system that had allowed people like him to operate unchecked for so long. Meanwhile, the investigation into Travis's conduct had begun, and it quickly became clear that there was much more to uncover. Reports of complaints filed against him started to surface, complaints that had mysteriously disappeared over the years, buried under layers of bureaucracy. Stories of harassment, excessive force, and blatant discrimination. It was as if a dam had burst, and now everything was spilling out, the ugly truth that so many had tried to hide for so long. The department was in turmoil, scrambling to control the damage. Chief Wallace found himself at the center of a storm, trying to navigate the fallout while maintaining order. He had always prided himself on being a fair, just leader, but now he was faced with a dilemma that tested everything he believed in. He could see the systemic issues, knew they existed, but acknowledging them publicly felt like betraying the very institution he had dedicated his life to. One afternoon, Monique received a call from Chief Wallace. "We need to meet," he said, his voice tense. "There are some things we need to discuss, face to face." An hour later, she was sitting across from him in a private room at the precinct. Wallace looked tired, as if the weight of the past few days had aged him. "I want to be clear," he began, his tone measured, "I don't condone what Travis did. And I understand why you're pushing for this investigation. But I need you to understand that this could have serious repercussions. For everyone." Monique's eyes narrowed slightly. "Are you asking me to back off?" she asked, her voice calm, but firm. "No," Wallace said quickly. "I'm asking you to think about what's at stake. The city is already on edge. We're seeing protests, people taking sides, and if this escalates, it could lead to more division, more conflict. We need to find a way to address this without tearing everything apart. And how do you suggest we do that?" Monique asked, leaning forward. "Because from where I'm sitting, the only way forward is to confront the problem head-on. Anything less is just a band-aid, and we both know it won't hold." Wallace sighed, rubbing his temples. "I'm not saying we shouldn't address it. But there has to be a way to do it that doesn't destroy the department. You've made your point, you've shown the public that you're serious about accountability. Maybe that's enough." Monique felt a surge of anger, but she kept it under control. "It's not enough," she said quietly. "Not when there are still people out there who are afraid to walk down the street because they don't know if they'll make it home. Not when there are officers who think they can act with impunity because they know the system will protect them. This isn't about making a point, Chief. It's about making a change." Wallace looked at her, his expression conflicted. "I respect what you're trying to do, Monique. I do. But there are forces at play here that you might not fully understand. Political forces, people with a lot of power who don't want to see this go any further." "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice sharp. "And I'm not afraid of them. If they want to stop me, they'll have to do it in the light of day, where everyone can see. Because I'm not going to hide, and I'm not going to back down." Wallace hesitated, then leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You're willing to risk everything for this, aren't you?" he said, almost to himself. "Yes," she said simply. Because this is bigger than me. It's bigger than you, or Travis, or even this department. It's about justice. It's about making sure that people know they have the right to be treated with dignity, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from. There was a long silence, and for a moment, Wallace just stared at her, as if trying to decide what to say. Finally, he spoke. "All right," he said quietly. "Then I'll support you. But you need to understand that once this starts, there's no going back. You're opening a door that can't be closed, and there will be consequences. For all of us." "I know," Monique said, standing up. "But I'm ready. And I hope you are too." As she left the precinct, she felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, because she had won a small victory in gaining Wallace's support, but also a deep sense of foreboding. She knew this was just the beginning, and that the hardest part was still ahead. Because now, it wasn't just about exposing Travis, it was about exposing the system that had protected him, and she knew there were people who would fight tooth and nail to stop her. But Monique was determined. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let fear or politics derail her mission. This wasn't just about justice for herself, it was about creating a city where people could walk with their heads held high, where no one had to live in fear of those who were supposed to protect them. As the days passed, the investigation deepened, uncovering more than anyone had expected. Officers who had been silent for years started to come forward, sharing stories of things they had seen, things they had been told to ignore. It was like peeling back the layers of a rotten onion, and the stench was overwhelming. But with every new piece of information, Monique's resolve only grew stronger. She knew there would be backlash, knew there would be those who would try to discredit her, to twist the narrative. But she also knew she had the truth on her side, and that was a power no one could take away from her. Now, the city was waiting, holding its breath, as the final pieces began to fall into place. And Monique could feel it, the tension building, the sense that something big was about to happen, something that would change everything. She just hoped that when it did, it would be enough. The investigation into Officer Travis Moore reached its conclusion, and the results were damning. Evidence of misconduct, abuse of power, and systemic neglect piled up, exposing a dark undercurrent that had been festering within the police department for years. Complaints that had been dismissed, reports that had been altered, and testimonies that had been ignored all pointed to a system that had protected not just Travis, but many like him. The final report was released to the public, and the city was shaken to its core. Monique had promised transparency, and she delivered. She stood at a press conference, reading out the findings, her voice unwavering as she detailed the systemic failures that had allowed officers like Travis to act with impunity. She didn't hold back, didn't sugarcoat the truth. It was harsh, but it was necessary. Standing beside her, Chief Wallace looked somber. He had made a choice, and he stood by it, even though he knew it would cost him. After the report was released, he announced his resignation, taking responsibility for the failures under his watch. "Leadership means owning up to your mistakes," he said, his voice heavy but resolute. "And if stepping down is what it takes to help rebuild trust, then that's what I'll do." It was a move that surprised many, but it also sent a powerful message. Wallace's resignation marked the beginning of a transformation within the department. New policies were enacted, old practices were dismantled, and training programs were overhauled. For the first time in a long time, there was hope that real, lasting change was possible. As for Travis, he faced his reckoning in a court of law. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his attempts to defend his actions only made things worse. In the end, he was found guilty of multiple counts of misconduct and was stripped of his badge. But his punishment didn't end there. The court ordered him to serve community service, specifically in programs that focused on rebuilding relationships between the police and the communities they had harmed. It was a bitter pill for him to swallow, to be forced to face the people he had mistreated, but it was also a chance for him to see the damage he had caused up close. Travis's life had changed irrevocably. The man who had once wielded his badge as a weapon now had to walk the same streets he once patrolled, not as an authority figure, but as a civilian. He was no longer untouchable, and that reality hit him hard. For the first time, he had to see the people he had ignored, listen to their stories, and understand the pain he had been a part of. Whether he would ever truly change was uncertain, but he no longer had the power to inflict harm without consequence. But the real triumph was Monique's. She had taken a moment of personal humiliation and turned it into a movement, a call for justice that resonated far beyond Atlanta. Her courage to stand up, to speak out, had inspired others to do the same. She became a symbol of resilience, not just for her city, but for anyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice. The reforms she championed began to take root. Community leaders and activists, who had once felt ignored, were now part of the conversation, helping to shape policies and rebuild trust. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges to overcome, but there was progress, and that was a victory in itself. Monique had made sure that the city's eyes were open, and she wasn't about to let them close again. 1 year after the incident, Monique stood on the steps of City Hall, looking out at the crowd gathered below. It was a warm afternoon, and the sun cast a soft glow over the city she loved. She took a deep breath and began to speak. A year ago, we were faced with a choice. We could have looked away, pretended everything was fine, and gone back to the way things were. Or we could confront the truth, no matter how uncomfortable, and choose to be better. We chose the latter. And I am proud of what we have accomplished, not because we're finished, but because we've started. The crowd erupted in applause, and Monique felt a swell of emotion. She had done what she set out to do, but she also knew there was still more work to be done. The fight for justice, for equality, was ongoing, but she had shown that it was possible to make a difference, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As she stepped away from the podium, she caught sight of Malik, her chief of staff, smiling at her. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with pride. "No," Monique replied, shaking her head. "We did it. All of us. And we're just getting started. What you've just heard is more than a story, it's a reminder. It's a reminder that the fight against injustice requires courage, resilience, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Monique's journey was not easy, but it shows us that when you stand up for what's right, you can spark change, no matter how small you feel in the face of a broken system. Think about the times in your life when you've been afraid to speak out, when you felt like your voice didn't matter. What if, instead of staying silent, you chose to stand tall, like Monique did? How different could things be if we all decided to confront the problems we see, instead of just looking away? Share your thoughts with us. What part of Monique's story resonated the most with you? How do you think we can all play a part in building a fairer, more just society? Let's keep the conversation going in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful narratives that challenge, inspire, and surprise. Hit that like button, share with your friends, and stay tuned for more. Your support helps us continue to tell stories that matter. Thank you for watching.